Mrs. General changed her gloves, as to the right glove being uppermost and the left undermost, with a prunes and prism smile. "To preserve your approbation, Mrs. General," said Fanny, returning the smile with one in which there was no trace of those ingredients, "will of course be the highest object of my married life. To lose it would be, of course, perfect wretchedness. I am sure your great kindness will not object, and I hope Papa will not object, to my correcting a small mistake you have made, however. The best of us are so liable to mistakes that even you, Mrs. General, have fallen into a little error. The attention and distinction you have so impressively mentioned, Mrs. General, as attaching to this confidence are, I have no doubt of, the most complimentary and gratifying description, but they don't at all proceed from me. The merit of having consulted you on the subject would have been so great in me that I feel I must not lay claim to it when it really is not mine. It is wholly Papa's. I am deeply obliged to you for your encouragement and patronage, but it was Papa who asked for it. I have to thank you, Mrs. General, for relieving my breast of a great weight by so handsomely giving your consent to my engagement, but you have really nothing to thank me for. I hope you will always approve of my proceedings after I have left home, and that my sister also may long remain the favoured object of your condescension, Mrs. General." With this address, which was delivered in her politest manner, Fanny left the room with an elegant and cheerful air, to tear upstairs with a flushed face as soon as she was out of hearing, pounce in upon her sister, call her a little dormouse, shake her for the better opening of her eyes, tell her what had passed below, and ask her what she thought of Pa now. Towards Mrs. Merdle, the young lady comported herself with great independence and self-possession, but not as yet with any more decided openings of hostilities. Occasionally they had a slight skirmish, as when Fanny considered herself patted on the back by that lady, or as when Mrs. Merdle looked particularly young and well, but Mrs. Merdle always soon terminated those passages of arms by sinking among her cushions with the gracefullest indifference, and finding her attention otherwise engaged. Society, for that mysterious creature sat upon the 7 Hills too, found Miss Fanny vastly improved by her engagement. She was much more accessible, much more free and engaging, much less exacting, insomuch that she now entertained a host of followers and admirers, to the bitter indignation of ladies with daughters to marry, who were to be regarded as having revolted from society on the Miss Dorrit grievance, and erected a rebellious standard. Enjoying the flutter she caused, Miss Dorrit not only haughtily moved through it in her own proper person, but haughtily, even ostentatiously, led Mr. Sparkler through it too, seeming to say to them all, "If I think proper too much among you in triumphal procession attended by this weak captive in bonds rather than a stronger one, that is my business. Enough that I choose to do it." Mr. Sparkler, for his part, questioned nothing, but went wherever he was taken, did whatever he was told, felt that for his bride-elect to be distinguished was for him to be distinguished on the easiest terms, and was truly grateful for being so openly acknowledged. The winter passing on towards the spring, while this condition of affairs prevailed, it became necessary for Mr. Sparkler to repair to England, and take his appointed part in the expression and direction of its genius, learning, commerce, spirit, and sense. The land of Shakespeare, Milton, Bacon, Newton, Watt, the land of a host of past and present abstract philosophers, natural philosophers, and subduers of nature and art in their myriad forms, called to Mr. Sparkler to come and take care of it, lest it should perish. Mr. Sparkler, unable to resist the agonized cry from the depths of his country's soul, declared that he must go. It followed that the question was rendered pressing when, where, and how Mr. Sparkler should be married to the foremost girl in all this world, with no nonsense about her. Its solution, after some little mystery and secrecy, Miss Fanny herself announced to her sister. "Now, my child," said she, seeking her out one day, "I am going to tell you something. It is only this moment broached, and naturally I hurry to you the moment it is broached. Your marriage, Fanny. My precious child, said Fanny, don't anticipate me. Let me impart my confidence to you, you flurried little thing, in my own way. As to your guess, if I answered it literally, I should answer no, for really it is not my marriage that is in question, half as much as it is Edmund's. Little Dorrit looked, and perhaps not altogether without cause, somewhat at a loss to understand this fine distinction. I am in no difficulty, exclaimed Fanny, and in no hurry. I am not wanted at any public office, or to give any vote anywhere else. But Edmund is, and Edmund is deeply dejected at the idea of going away by himself, and indeed I don't like that he should be trusted by himself, for if it's possible, and it generally is, to do a foolish thing, he is sure to do it. As she concluded this impartial summary of the reliance that might be safely placed upon her future husband, she took off, with an air of business, the bonnet she wore, and dangled it by its strings upon the ground. It is far more Edmund's question, therefore, than mine. However, we need say no more about that. That is self-evident on the face of it. Well, my dearest Amy, the point arising, is he to go by himself, or is he not to go by himself? This other point arises, are we to be married here and shortly, or are we to be married at home months hence? I see I am going to lose you, Fanny. What a little thing you are, cried Fanny, half tolerant and half impatient, for anticipating one. Pray, my darling, hear me out. That woman, she spoke of Mrs. Merdle, of course, remains here until after Easter, so in the case of my being married here and going to London with Edmund, I should have the start of her. That is something. Further, Amy, that woman being out of the way, I don't know that I greatly object to Mr. Merdle's proposal to Pa that Edmund and I should take up our abode in that house, you know, where you once went with a dancer, my dear, until our own house can be chosen and fitted up. Further still, Amy, Papa having always intended to go to town himself in the spring, you see, if Edmund and I were married here, we might go off to Florence, where Papa might join us, and we might all three travel home together. Mr. Merdle has entreated Pa to stay with him in that same mansion I have mentioned, and I suppose he will. But he is master of his own actions, and upon that point, which is not at all material, I can't speak positively. The difference between Papa being master of his own actions and Mr. Sparkler's being nothing of the sort was forcibly expressed by Fanny in her manner of stating the case. Not that her sister noticed it, for she was divided between regret at the coming separation and a lingering wish that she had been included in the plans for visiting England. And these are the arrangements, Fanny dear? Arrangements, repeated Fanny. Now really, child, you are a little trying. You know I particularly guarded myself against laying my words open to any such construction. What I said was that certain questions present themselves, and these are the questions. Little Dorrit's thoughtful eyes met hers, tenderly and quietly. Not my own sweet girl, said Fanny, weighing her bonnet by the strings with considerable impatience. It's no use staring. A little owl could stare. I look to you for advice, Amy. What do you advise me to do? Do you think, asked Little Dorrit persuasively, after a short hesitation, do you think, Fanny, that if you were to put it off for a few months, it might be, considering all things, best? No, little tortoise, retorted Fanny with exceeding sharpness. I don't think anything of the kind. Here she threw her bonnet from her altogether and flounced into a chair. But, becoming affectionate almost immediately, she flounced out of it again and kneeled down on the floor to take her sister, chair and all, in her arms. Don't suppose I am hasty or unkind, darling, because I really am not. But you are such a little oddity. You make one bite your head off when one wants to be soothing beyond everything. Didn't I tell you, you dearest baby, that Edmund can't be trusted by himself, and don't you know that he can't? Yes, Fanny, you said so, I know. And you know it, I know, retorted Fanny. Well, my precious child, if he is not to be trusted by himself, it follows, I suppose, that I should go with him. It seems so, love, said Little Dorrit. Therefore, having heard the arrangements that are feasible to carry out that object, Am I to understand, dearest Amy, that on the whole you advise me to make them?" "It seems so, love," said little Dorrit again. "Very well," cried Fanny, with an air of resignation. "Then I suppose it must be done. I came to you, my sweet, the moment I saw the doubt and the necessity of deciding. I have now decided. So let it be." After yielding herself up in this pattern manner to sisterly advice and the force of circumstances, Fanny became quite benignant, as one who had laid her own inclinations at the feet of her dearest friend and felt a glow of conscience in having made the sacrifice. "After all, my Amy," she said to her sister, "you are the best of all small creatures and full of good sense, and I don't know what I shall ever do without you." With which words she folded her in a closer embrace, and a really fond one. "Not that I contemplate doing without you, Amy, by any means, for I hope we shall be next to inseparable. And now, my pet, I am going to give you a word of advice. When you are left alone here with Mrs. General—" "I am to be left alone here with Mrs. General?" said little Dorrit quietly. "Why, of course, my precious, till Papa comes back, unless you call Edward company, which he certainly is not, even when he is here, and still more certainly is not when he is away at Naples or in Sicily. I was going to say, but you are such a beloved little marplot for putting one out. When you are left alone here with Mrs. General, Amy, don't you let her slide into any sort of artful understanding with you that she is looking after Pa, or that Pa is looking after her. She will if she can. I know her sly manner of feeling her way with those gloves of hers, but don't you comprehend her on any account. And if Pa should tell you when he comes back that he has it in contemplation to make Mrs. General your mamma, which is not the less likely because I am going away, my advice to you is that you say at once, 'Papa, I beg you to object most strongly. Fanny cautioned me about this, and she objected and I object.' I don't mean to say that any objection from you, Amy, is likely to be of the smallest effect, or that I think you likely to make it with any degree of firmness. But there is a principle involved, a filial principle, and I implore you not to submit to be mother-in-lawed by Mrs. General without asserting it in making every one about you as uncomfortable as possible. I don't expect you to stand by it. Indeed, I know you won't, Pa being concerned, but I wish to rouse you to a sense of duty. As to any help from me, or as to any opposition that I can offer to such a match, you shall not be left in the lurch, my love. Whatever weight I may derive from my position as a married girl not wholly devoid of attractions, used as that position always shall be to oppose that woman, I will bring to bear. You may depend upon it, on the head and false hair, for I am confident it is not all real, ugly as it is, and unlikely as it appears, that anyone in their senses would go to the expense of buying it of Mrs. General." Little Dorrit received this counsel without venturing to oppose it, but without giving Fanny any reason to believe that she intended to act upon it. Having now, as it were, formally wound up her single life and arranged her worldly affairs, Fanny proceeded with characteristic ardour to prepare for the serious change in her condition. The preparation consisted in the dispatch of her maid to Paris under the protection of the courier, for the purchase of that outfit for a bride on which it would be extremely low in the present narrative to bestow an English name, but to which, on a vulgar principle it observes of adhering to the language in which it professes to be written, it declines to give a French one. The rich and beautiful wardrobe purchased by these agents in the course of a few weeks made its way through the intervening country, bristling with custom-houses, garrisoned by an immense army of shabby mendicants in uniform who incessantly repeated the beggar's petition over it, as if every individual warrior among them were the ancient Belisarius, and of whom there were so many legions that unless the courier had expended just 1.5 bushels of silver money relieving their distresses, they would have worn the wardrobe out before it got to Rome, by turning it over and over. Through all such dangers, however, it was triumphantly brought, inch by inch, and arrived at its journey's end in fine condition. There it was exhibited to select companies of female viewers, in whose gentle bosoms it awakened implacable feelings. Concurrently, active preparations were made for the day on which some of its treasures were to be publicly displayed. Cards of breakfast, invitation were sent out to half the English in the city of Romulus, the other half made arrangements to be under arms, as criticizing volunteers at various outer points of the solemnity. The most high and illustrious English Signor Edgardo Dorrit came post through the deep mud and ruts from forming a surface under the improving Neapolitan nobility to grace the occasion. The best hotel and all its culinary myrmidons were set to work to prepare the feast. The draughts of Mr. Dorrit almost constituted a run on the Torlonia Bank. The British consul hadn't such a marriage in the whole of his consularity. The day came, and the she-wolf in the capital might have snarled with envy to see how the island savages contrived these things nowadays. The murderous-headed statues of the wicked emperors of the soldiery, whom sculptors had not been able to flatter out of their villainous hideousness, might have come off their pedestals to run away with the bride. The choked old fountain, where erst the gladiators washed, might have leapt into life again to honour the ceremony. The temple of Vesta might have sprung up anew from its ruins, expressly to lend its countenance to the occasion. Might have done, but did not. Like sentient beings, even like the lords and ladies of creation sometimes, might have done much, but did nothing. The celebration went off with admirable pomp. Monks in black robes, white robes and russet, robes stopped to look after the carriages, wandering peasants in fleeces of sheep, begged and piped under the house windows, the English volunteers defiled, the day wore on to the hour of vespers. The festival wore away, the 1,000 churches rang their bells without any reference to it, and St. Peter denied that he had anything to do with it. But by that time the bride was near the end of the first day's journey towards Florence. It was the peculiarity of the nuptials that they were all bride. Nobody noticed the bridegroom. Nobody noticed the first bridesmaid. Few could have seen little Dorit, who held that post, for the glare, even supposing many to have sought her. So the bride had mounted into her handsome chariot, incidentally accompanied by the bridegroom, and after rolling for a few minutes smoothly over a fair pavement, had begun to jolt through a slough of despond, and through a long, long avenue of wrack and ruin. Other nuptial carriages are said to have gone the same road, before and since. If little Dorrit found herself left a little lonely and a little low that night, nothing would have done so much against her feeling of depression as the being able to sit at work by her father as in the old time, and help him to his supper and his rest. But that was not to be thought of now, when they sat in the state equipage with Mrs. General on the coach-box. And as to supper, if Mr. Dorrit had wanted supper, there was an Italian cook, and there was a Swiss confectioner, who must have put on caps as high as the Pope's mitre, and have performed the mysteries of alchemists in a copper saucepan laboratory below, before he could have got it. He was sententious and didactic that night. If he had been simply loving, he would have done little Dorrit more good, but she accepted him as he was. When had she not accepted him as he was, and made the most and best of him? Mrs. General at length retired. Her retirement for the night was always her frostiest ceremony, as if she felt it necessary that the human imagination should be chilled into stone to prevent its following her. When she had gone through her rigid preliminaries, amounting to a sort of genteel platoon exercise, she withdrew. Little Dorrit then put her arm round her father's neck to bid him good night. "Amy, my dear," said Mr. Dorrit, taking her by the hand, "this is the close of a day that has, greatly impressed and gratified me. A little tired you, dear, too?" "No," said Mr. Dorrit. "No, I am not sensible of fatigue when it arises from an occasion so, replete with gratification of the purest kind." Little Dorrit was glad to find him in such heart, and smiled from her own heart. "My dear," he continued, "this is an occasion teeming with a good example, with a good example, my favourite and attached child, to you." Little Dorrit, fluttered by his words, did not know what to say, though he stopped as if he expected her to say something. "Amy," he resumed, "your dear sister, our Fanny, has contracted a marriage eminently calculated to extend the basis of our connection and to consolidate our social relations. My love, I trust that time is not far distant when some eligible partner may be found for you." "Oh, no, let me stay with you. I beg and pray that I may stay with you. I want nothing but to stay and take care of you." She said it like one in sudden alarm. "Nay, Amy, Amy," said Mr. Dorrit. "This is weak and foolish, weak and foolish. You have a responsibility imposed upon you by your position. It is to develop that position and be worthy of that position. As to taking care of me, I can take care of myself. Or," he added after a moment, "if I should need to be taken care of, I can, with the blessing of Providence, be taken care of. I cannot, my dear child, think of engrossing and, as it were, sacrificing you." Oh, what a time of day at which to begin that profession of self-denial, at which to make it, with an air of taking credit for it, at which to believe it, if such a thing could be. "Don't speak, Amy. I positively say I cannot do it. I must not do it. My conscience would not allow it. I therefore, my love, take the opportunity afforded by this gratifying and impressive occasion of solemnly remarking that it is now a cherished wish and purpose of mine to see you eligibly, I repeat, eligibly married." "Oh, no, dear, pray." "Amy," said Mr. Dorrit, "I am well persuaded that if the topic were referred to any person of superior social knowledge, of superior delicacy and sense, let us say, for instance, to Mrs. General, that there would not be two opinions as to the affectionate character and propriety of my sentiments. But as I know your loving and dutiful nature from experience, I am quite satisfied that it is necessary to say no more. I have no husband to propose at present, my dear. I have not even one in view. I merely wish that we should understand each other. Good night, my dear and sole remaining daughter. Good night. God bless you." If the thought ever entered Little Dorrit's head that night, that he could give her up lightly now in his prosperity, and when he had it in his mind to replace her with a second wife, she drove it away. Faithful to him still, as in the worst times through which she had borne him single-handed, she drove the thought away, and entertained no harder reflection in her tearful unrest than that he now saw everything through their wealth, and through the care he always had upon him that they should continue rich and grow richer. They sat in their equipage of state, with Mrs. General on the box, for 3 weeks longer, and then he started for Florence to join Fanny. Little Dorrit would have been glad to bear him company so far, only for the sake of her own love, and then to have turned back alone, thinking of dear England. But though the courier had gone on with the bride, the valet was next in line, and the succession would not have come to her as long as anyone could be got for money. Mrs. General took life easily, as easily, that is, as she could take anything, when the Roman establishment remained in their sole occupation, and Little Dorrit would often ride out in a hired carriage that was left them, and alight alone and wander among the ruins of old Rome. The ruins of the vast old amphitheatre, of the old temples, of the old commemorative arches, of the old trodden highways, of the old tombs, besides being what they were, to her were ruins of the old Marshalsea, ruins of her own old life, ruins of the faces and forms that of old peopled it, ruins of its loves, hopes, cares, and joys. Two ruined spheres of action and suffering were before the solitary girl, often sitting on some broken fragment, and in the lonely places, under the blue sky, she saw them both together. Up, then, would come Mrs. General, taking all the colour out of everything, as nature and art had taken it out of herself. writing prunes and prism in Mr. Eustace's text wherever she could lay a hand, looking everywhere for Mr. Eustace and Company, and seeing nothing else, scratching up the driest little bones of antiquity, and bolting them whole without any human visitings, like a ghoul in gloves. Chapter 16. Getting On. The newly married pair, on their arrival in Harley Street, Cavendish Square, London, were received by the chief butler. That great man was not interested in them, but on the whole endured them. People must continue to be married and given in marriage, or chief butlers would not be wanted. As nations are made to be taxed, so families are made to be butlered. The chief butler, no doubt, reflected that the course of nature required the wealthy population to be kept up on his account. He therefore condescended to look at the carriage from the hall door without frowning at it, and said, in a very handsome way, to one of his men, "Thomas, help with the luggage." He even escorted the bride upstairs into Mr. Merdle's presence, but this must be considered as an act of homage to the sex, of which he was an admirer, being notoriously captivated by the charms of a certain duchess, and not as a committal of himself with the family. Mr. Merdle was slinking about the hearthrug, waiting to welcome Mrs. Sparkler. His hand seemed to retreat up his sleeve as he advanced to do so, and he gave her such a superfluity of coat-cuff that it was like being received by the popular conception of Guy Fawkes. When he put his lips to hers, besides, he took himself into custody by the wrists, and backed himself among the ottomans and chairs and tables, as if he were his own police officer, saying to himself, "Now, none of that. Come, I've got you, you know, and you go quietly along with me." Mrs. Sparkler, installed in the rooms of state, the innermost sanctuary of down, silk, chintz, and fine linen, felt that so far her triumph was good, and her way made step by step. On the day before her marriage, she had bestowed on Mrs. Merdle's maid, with an air of gracious indifference, in Mrs. Merdle's presence, a trifling little keepsake, bracelet, bonnet, and 2 dresses, all new, about 4 times as valuable as the present formerly made by Mrs. Merdle to her. She was now established in Mrs. Merdle's own rooms, to which some extra touches had been given to render them more worthy of her occupation. In her mind's eye, as she lounged there, surrounded by every luxurious accessory that wealth could obtain or invention devise, she saw the fair bosom that beat in unison with the exaltation of her thoughts, competing with the bosom that had been famous so long, outshining it and deposing it. Happy? Fanny must have been happy. No more wishing oneself dead now. The courier had not approved of Mr. Dorrit staying in the house of a friend, and had preferred to take him to an hotel in Brook Street, Grosvenor Square. Mr. Merdle ordered his carriage to be ready early in the morning, that he might wait upon Mr. Dorrit immediately after breakfast. Bright the carriage looked, sleek the horses looked, gleaming the harness looked, luscious and lasting the liveries looked. A rich, responsible turnout, an equipage for a Merdle. Early people looked after it as it rattled along the streets, and said, with awe in their breath, "There he goes." There he went until Brook Street stopped him. Then forth from its magnificent case came the jewel, not lustrous in itself, but quite the contrary. Commotion in the office of the hotel. Merdle, the landlord, though a gentleman of a haughty spirit who had just driven a pair of thoroughbred horses into town, turned out to show him upstairs. The clerks and servants cut him off by back passages, and were found accidentally hovering in doorways and angles, that they might look upon him. Merdle, O ye sun, moon, and stars, the great man, the rich man, who had in a manner revised the New Testament, and already entered into the kingdom of heaven, the man who could have any one he chose to dine with him, and who had made the money. As he went up the stairs, people were already posted on the lower stairs, that his shadow might fall upon them when he came down. So were the sick brought out and laid in the track of the apostle, who had not got into the good society and had not made the money. Mr. Dorrit, dressing-gowned and newspapered, was at his breakfast. The courier, with agitation in his voice, announced, "Miss Meredale." Mr. Dorrit's overwrought heart bounded as he leapt up. "Mr. Merdle, this is indeed an honour. Permit me to express the high sense I entertain of this highly gratifying of attention. I am well aware, sir, of the many demands upon your time and its enormous value." Mr. Dorrit could not say enormous roundly enough for his own satisfaction. "That you should, this early hour, bestow any of your priceless time upon me is a compliment that I acknowledge with the greatest esteem." Mr. Dorrit positively trembled in addressing the great man. Mr. Merdle uttered in his subdued, inward, hesitating voice a few sounds that were to no purpose whatever, and finally said, "I am glad to see you, sir." "You are very kind," said Mr. Dorrit, "truly kind." By this time the visitor was seated, and was passing his great hand over his exhausted forehead. "You are well, I hope, Mr. Merdle?" I am well, as usually I am," said Mr. Merdle. "Your occupations must be immense." "Tolerably so, but, oh dear no, there's not much the matter with me," said Mr. Merdle, looking round the room. "A little dyspeptic?" Mr. Dorrit hinted. "Very likely, but I'm well enough," said Mr. Merdle. There were black traces on his lips where they met, as if a little train of gunpowder had been fired there, and he looked like a man who, if his natural temperament had been quicker, would have been very feverish that morning. This, and his heavy way of passing his hand over his forehead, had prompted Mr. Dorrit's solicitous inquiries. "Mrs. Merdle," Mr. Dorrit insinuatingly pursued, "I left, as you will be prepared to hear, the observed of all observers, the admired of all admirers, the leading fascination and charm of society in Rome. She was looking wonderfully well when I quitted her." "Mrs. Merdle," said Mr. Merdle, "is generally considered a very attractive woman, and she is, no doubt, I am sensible of her being so." "Who can be otherwise?" responded Mr. Dorrit. Mr. Merdle turned his tongue in his closed mouth. It seemed rather a stiff and unmanageable tongue, moistened his lips, passed his hand over his forehead again, and looked all round the room again, principally under the chairs. "But," he said, looking Mr. Dorrit in the face for the first time, and immediately afterwards dropping his eyes to the buttons of Mr. Dorrit's waistcoat, "if we speak of attractions, your daughter ought to be the subject of our conversation. She is extremely beautiful, both in face and figure. She is quite uncommon. When the young people arrived last night, I was really surprised to see such charms." Mr. Dorrit's gratification was such that he said, "Ah!" He could not refrain from telling Mr. Merdle verbally, as he had already done by letter, what honour and happiness he felt in this union of their families. And he offered his hand. Mr. Merdle looked at the hand for a little while, took it on his for a moment, as if his were a yellow salver or fish slice, and then returned it to Mr. Dorrit. "I thought I would drive round the first thing," said Mr. Merdle, "to offer my services in case I can do anything for you, and to say that I hope you will at least do me the honour of dining with me today and every day when you are not better engaged during your stay in town." Mr. Dorrit was enraptured by these attentions. "Do you stay long, sir?" "I have not at present the intention," said Mr. Dorrit, "of exceeding a fortnight." "That's a very short stay after so long a journey," returned Mr. Merdle. "Yes," said Mr. Dorrit, "but the truth is, my dear Mr. Merdle, that I find a foreign life so well suited to my health and taste that I have but two objects in my present visit to London. First, the distinguished happiness and privilege which I now enjoy and appreciate. Secondly, the arrangement, the laying out, that is to say, in the best way, of my money." "Well, sir," said Mr. Merdle, after turning his tongue again, "if I can be of any use to you in that respect, you may command me." Mr. Dorrit's speech had more hesitation in it than usual as he approached the ticklish topic, for he was not perfectly clear how so exalted a potentate might take it. He had doubts whether reference to any individual capital or fortune might not seem a wretchedly retail affair to so wholesale a dealer. Greatly relieved by Mr. Merdle's affable offer of assistance, he caught at it directly and heaped acknowledgments upon him. "I scarcely dared," said Mr. Dorrit, "I assure you, to hope for so vast an advantage as your direct advice and assistance. Though, of course, I should, under any circumstances, like the rest of the civilized world, have followed in Mr. Merdle's train." "You know, we may almost say we are related, sir," said Mr. Merdle, curiously interested in the pattern of the carpet, "and therefore you may consider me at your service." "Ah, very handsome indeed," cried Mr. Dorrit. "Ah, most handsome." "It would not," said Mr. Merdle, "be at the present moment easy for what I may call a mere outsider to come into any of the good things. Of course, I speak of my own good things." Of course," cried Mr. Dorrit in a tone implying that there were no other good things, unless at a high price, at what we are accustomed to term a very long figure. Mr. Dorrit laughed in the buoyancy of his spirit. "Ah, long figure, good, very expensive, to be sure. However," said Mr. Merdle, "I do generally retain in my own hands the power of exercising some preference. People in general would be pleased to call it favour, as a sort of compliment for my care and trouble." "And public spirit and genius," Mr. Dorrit suggested. Mr. Merdle, with a dry swallowing action, seemed to dispose of those qualities like a bolus, then added, "As a sort of return for it, I will see, if you please, how I can exert this limited power, for people are jealous, and it is limited, to your advantage." "You are very good," replied Mr. Dorrit. "You are very good." "Of course," said Mr. Merdle, "there must be the strictest integrity and uprightness in these transactions. There must be the purest faith between man and man. There must be unimpeached and unimpeachable confidence, or business could not be carried on." Mr. Dorrit hailed these generous sentiments with fervour. "Therefore," said Mr. Merdle, "I can only give you a preference to a certain extent." "I perceive, to a defined extent," observed Mr. Dorrit. "Defined extent, and perfectly above board. As to my advice, however," said Mr. Merdle, "that is another matter. That, such as it is—" "Oh, such as it was!" Mr. Dorrit could not bear the faintest appearance of its being depreciated even by Mr. Merdle himself. "That there is nothing in the bonds of spotless honour between myself and my fellow man to prevent my parting with if I choose, and that," said Mr. Merdle, now deeply intent upon a dust cart that was passing the windows, "shall be at your command whenever you think proper." New acknowledgments from Mr. Dorrit, new passages from Mr. Merdle's hand over his forehead, calm and silence, contemplation of Mr. Dorrit's waistcoat buttons by Mr. Merdle. "My time being rather precious," said Mr. Merdle, suddenly getting up, as if he had been waiting in the interval for his legs, and they had just come, "I must be moving towards the city. Can I take you anywhere, sir? I shall be happy to set you down or send you on. My carriage is at your disposal." Mr. Dorrit bethought himself that he had business at his banker's. His banker's was in the city. That was fortunate. Mr. Merdle would take him into the city. But surely he might not detain Mr. Merdle while he assumed his coat. Yes, he might and must. Mr. Merdle insisted on it. So Mr. Dorrit, retiring into the next room, put himself under the hands of his valet, and in 5 minutes came back glorious. "Then," said Mr. Merdle, "allow me, sir, take my arm." Then, leaning on Mr. Merdle's arm, did Mr. Dorrit descend the staircase, seeing the worshippers on the steps, and feeling that the light of Mr. Merdle shone by reflection in himself. Then the carriage, and the ride into the city, and the people who looked at them, and the hats that flew off grey heads, and the general bowing and crouching before this wonderful mortal, the like of which prostration of spirit was not to be seen, no, by heaven, no. It may be worth thinking of by fawners of all denominations, in Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's Cathedral put together, on any Sunday in the year. It was a rapturous dream to Mr. Dorrit to find himself set aloft in this public car of triumph, making a magnificent progress to that befitting destination, the golden street of the Lombards. There Mr. Merdle insisted on alighting and going his way afoot, and leaving his poor equipage at Mr. Dorrit's disposition. So the stream increased in rapture when Mr. Dorrit came out of the bank alone, and people looked at him in default of Mr. Merdle, and when, with the ears of his mind, he heard the frequent exclamation as he rolled glibly along, "A wonderful man to be Mr. Merdle's friend." At dinner that day, although the occasion was not foreseen and provided for, a brilliant company of such as are not made of the dust of the earth, but of some superior article for the present unknown, shed their lustrous benediction upon Mr. Dorrit's daughter's marriage. And Mr. Dorrit's daughter that day began, in earnest, her competition with that woman not present, and began it so well that Mr. Dorrit could all but have taken his affidavit, if required, that Mrs. Sparkler had all her life been lying at full length in the lap of luxury, and had never heard of such a rough word in the English tongue as Marshalsea. Next day, and the day after, and every day, all graced by more dinner company, cards descended on Mr. Dorrit like theatrical snow. As the friend and relative by marriage of the illustrious Merdle, bar, bishop, treasury, chorus, everybody wanted to make or improve Mr. Dorrit's acquaintance. In Mr. Merdle's heap of offices in the city, when Mr. Dorrit appeared at any of them, on his business taking him eastward, which it frequently did, for it throve amazingly, the name of Dorrit was always a passport to the great presence of Merdle. So the dream increased in rapture every hour, as Mr. Dorrit felt increasingly sensible that this connection had brought him forward indeed. Only one thing sat otherwise auriferously, and at the same time lightly on Mr. Dorrit's mind. It was the chief butler. That stupendous character looked at him, in the course of his official looking at the dinners, in a manner that Mr. Dorrit considered questionable. He looked at him as he passed through the hall and up the staircase, going to dinner, with a glazed fixedness that Mr. Dorrit did not like. Seated at table in the act of drinking, Mr. Dorrit still saw him through his wine-glass, regarding him with a cold and ghostly eye. It misgave him that the chief butler must have known a collegian, and must have seen him in the college, perhaps had been presented to him. He looked as closely at the chief butler as such a man could be looked at, and yet he did not recall that he had ever seen him elsewhere. Ultimately, he was inclined to think that there was no reverence in the man, no sentiment in the great creature, but he was not relieved by that, for, let them think what he would, the chief butler had him in his supercilious eye, even when that eye was on the plate and other table garniture, and he never let him out of it. To hint at him that this confinement in his eye was disagreeable, or to ask him what he meant, was an act too daring to venture upon, his severity with his employers and their visitors being terrific, and he never permitting himself to be approached with the slightest liberty. Chapter 17. Missing. The term of Mr. Dorrit's visit was within 2 days of being out, and he was about to dress for another inspection by the chief butler, whose victims were always dressed expressly for him, when one of the servants of the hotel presented himself bearing a card. Mr. Dorrit, taking it, read, "Mrs. Finching." The servant waited in speechless deference. Man," said Mr. Dorrit, turning upon him with grievous indignation, "explain your motive in bringing me this ridiculous name. I am wholly unacquainted with it." "Finching, sir?" said Mr. Dorrit, perhaps avenging himself on the chief butler by substitute. What do you mean by finching?" The man seemed to mean flinching as much as anything else, for he backed away from Mr. Dorrit's severe regard, as he replied, "A lady, sir." "I know no such lady," said Mr. Dorrit. "Take this card away. I know no finching of either sex." "Ask your pardon, sir. The lady said she was aware she might be unknown by name, but she begged me to say, sir, that she had formerly the honour of being acquainted with Miss Dorit. The lady said, sir, the youngest Miss Dorit." Mr. Dorrit knitted his brows and rejoined, after a moment or two, Inform Mrs. Finching, sir," emphasizing the name as if the innocent man was solely responsible for it, "that she can come up." He had reflected in his momentary pause that unless she were admitted she might leave some message, or might say something below, having a disgraceful reference to that former state of existence. Hence the concession, and hence the appearance of Flora, piloted in by the man. "I have not had the pleasure," said Mr. Dorrit, standing with the card in his hand, and with an air which imported that it would scarcely have been a first-class pleasure if he had had it, "of knowing either this name or yourself, madam. Place a chair, sir." The responsible man with a start obeyed, and went out on tiptoe. Flora, putting aside her veil with a bashful tremor upon her, proceeded to introduce herself. At the same time, a singular combination of perfumes was diffused through the room, as if some brandy had been put by mistake in a lavender water bottle, or as if some lavender water had been put by mistake in a brandy bottle. "I beg Mr. Dorrit to offer 1,000 apologies, and indeed they would be far too few for such an intrusion, which I know must appear extremely bold in a lady, and alone too, but I thought it best upon the whole, however difficult, and even apparently improper though Mr. F.'s aunt would have willingly accompanied me, and as a character of great force and spirit would probably have struck one possessed of such a knowledge of life as no doubt with so many changes must have been acquired, for Mr. F. himself said frequently that although well educated in the neighbourhood of Blackheath at as high as 80 guineas, which is a good deal for parents, and the plate kept back too on going away, but that is more a meanness than in its value, that he had learned more in his first years as a commercial traveller with a large commission on the sale of an article, that nobody would hear of, much less by which preceded the wine trade a long time, than in the whole 6 years in that academy, conducted by a college bachelor, though why a bachelor more clever than a married man I do not see, and never did, but pray excuse me, that is not the point." Mr. Dorrit stood rooted to the carpet, a statue of mystification. "I must openly admit that I have no pretensions," said Flora, "but having known the dear little thing which under altered circumstances appears a liberty but is not so intended, and goodness knows there was no favour in 1/2 a day to such a needle as herself, but quite the other way, and as to anything lowering in it, far from it, the labourer is worthy of his hire, and I am sure I only wish he got it oftener, and more animal food and less rheumatism in the back and legs, poor soul." "Madam," said Mr. Dorrit, recovering his breath by a great effort, and as the relict of the late Mr. Finching stopped to take hers, "Madam," said Mr. Dorrit, very red in the face, "if I understand you to refer to anything in the antecedents of a daughter of mine involving a daily compensation, madam, I beg to observe that the fact, assuming it to be fact, never was within my knowledge. I should not have permitted it. Never, never." "Unnecessary to pursue the subject," returned Flora, "and would not have mentioned it on any account except as supposing it a favourable and only letter of introduction, but as to being fact, no doubt whatever, and you may set your mind at rest, for the very dress I have on now can prove it, and sweetly made, though there is no denying that it would tell better on a better figure, for my own is much too fat, though how to bring it down I know not. Pray excuse me, I am roving off again." Mr. Dorrit backed to his chair in a stony way, and seated himself as Flora gave him a softening look, and played with her parasol. "The dear little thing," said Flora, "having gone off perfectly limp and white and cold in my house, or at least papa's, for though not a freehold, still a long lease at a peppercorn, on the morning when Arthur, foolish habit of our youthful days, and Mr. Clennam, far more adapted to existing circumstances, particularly addressing a stranger, and that stranger a gentleman in an elevated station, communicated the glad tidings imparted by a person of name of Panks, emboldens me." At the mention of these two names, Mr. Dorrit frowned, stared, frowned again, hesitated with his finger at his lips, as he had hesitated long ago, and said, "Do me the favour to state your pleasure, madam." "Mr. Dorrit," said Flora, You are very kind in giving me permission, and highly natural it seems to me that you should be kind enough, for though more stately, I perceive a likeness filled out of course, but a likeness still. The object of my intruding is my own, without the slightest consultation with any human being, and most decidedly not with Arthur. Pray excuse me, Doyson Clennam. I don't know what I am saying, Mr. Clennam Solus, for to put that individual linked by a golden chain to a purple time when all was ethereal out of any anxiety would be worth to me the ransom of a monarch. Not that I have the least idea how much that would come to, but using it as the total of all I have in the world and more. Mr. Dorrit, without greatly regarding the earnestness of these latter words, repeated, "State your pleasure, madam." "It's not likely, I well know," said Flora, "but it's possible, and being possible, when I had the gratification of reading in the papers that you had arrived from Italy and were going back, I made up my mind to try it, for you might come across him or hear something of him, and if so, what a blessing and relief to all." Allow me to ask, madam," said Mr. Dorrit, with his ideas in wild confusion, to whom, he repeated it with a raised voice in mere desperation, "you at present allude?" "To the foreigner from Italy who disappeared in the city, as no doubt you have read in the papers equally with myself," said Flora, "not referring to private sources by the name of Panks, from which one gathers what dreadfully ill-natured things some people are wicked enough to whisper, most likely judging others by themselves, and what the uneasiness and indignation of Arthur, quite unable to overcome it, Doyson Clennam cannot fail to be." It happened, fortunately for the elucidation of any intelligible result, that Mr. Dorrit had heard or read nothing about the matter. This caused Mrs. Finching, with many apologies for being in great practical difficulties, as to finding the way to her pocket among the stripes of her dress, at length to produce a police handbill, setting forth that a foreign gentleman of the name of Blondois, last from Venice, had unaccountably disappeared on such a night in such a part of the city of London, that he was known to have entered such a house at such an hour, that he was stated by the inmates of that house to have left it about so many minutes before midnight, and that he had never been beheld since. This, with the exact particulars of time and locality, and with a good detailed description of the foreign gentleman who had so mysteriously vanished, Mr. Dorrit read at large. "Blondois," said Mr. Dorrit. "Venice. And this description. I know this gentleman. He has been in my house. He is intimately acquainted with a gentleman of good family, but in indifferent circumstances, of whom I am patron." "Then my humble and pressing entreaty is the more," said Flora, "that in travelling back you will have the kindness to look for this foreign gentleman along all the roads and up and down all the turnings, and to make inquiries for him at all the hotels and orange trees and vineyards and volcanoes and places, for he must be somewhere, and why doesn't he come forward and say he's there and clear all parties up?" "Pray, madam," said Mr. Dorrit, referring to the handbill again, "who is Clennam and Co.?" "Ah, I see the name mentioned here, in connection with the occupation of the house which Monsieur Blondois was seen to enter. Who is Clennam and Co.? Is it the individual of whom I had formerly some slight transitory knowledge, and to whom I believe you have referred? Is it that person?" "It is a very different person indeed," replied Flora, "with no limbs and wheels instead, and the grimmest of women, though his mother." "Clennam and Co. A mother?" exclaimed Dorrit. "And an old man besides," said Flora. Mr. Dorrit looked as if he must immediately be driven out of his mind by this account. Neither was it rendered more favourable to sanity by Flora's dashing into a rapid analysis of Mr. Flintwinch's cravat, and describing him, without the lightest boundary line of separation between his identity and Mrs. Clennam's, as a rusty screw in gaiters. Which compound of man and woman, no limbs, wheels, rusty screw, grimness, and gaiters, so completely stupefied Mr. Dorrit that he was a spectacle to be pitied. "But I would not detain you one moment longer," said Flora, upon whom his condition wrought its effect, though she was quite unconscious of having produced it, "if you would have the goodness to give your promise as a gentleman that both in going back to Italy and in Italy too, you would look for this Mr. Blondois high and low, and if you found or heard of him, make him come forward for the clearing of all parties." By that time Mr. Dorrit had so far recovered from his bewilderment as to be able to say, in a tolerably connected manner, that he should consider that his duty. Flora was delighted with her success, and rose to take her leave. "With a million thanks," said she, "and my address upon my card in case of anything to be communicated personally, I will not send my love to the dear little thing, for it might not be acceptable, and indeed there is no little thing left in the transformation, so why do it? But both myself and Mr. F.'s aunt ever wish her well, and lay no claim to any favour on our side, you may be sure of that, but quite the other way, for what she undertook to do she did, and that is more than a great many of us do, not to say anything of her doing it as well as it could be done, and I myself am one of them, for I have said ever since I began to recover the blow of Mr. F.'s death that I would learn the organ of which I am extremely fond, but of which I am ashamed to say I do not yet know a note. Good evening." When Mr. Dorrit, who attended her to the room door, had had a little time to collect his senses, he found that the interview had summoned back discarded reminiscences which jarred with the Myrtle dinner-table. He wrote and sent off a brief note, excusing himself for that day, and ordered dinner presently in his own rooms at the hotel. He had another reason for this. His time in London was very nearly out, and was anticipated by engagements. His plans were made for returning, and he thought it behoved his importance to pursue some direct inquiry into the Blondois disappearance, and be in a condition to carry back to Mr. Henry Gowan the result of his own personal investigation. He therefore resolved that he would take advantage of that evening's freedom to go down to Clenham & Co.'s, easily to be found by the directions set forth in the handbill, and see the place, and ask a question or two there himself. Having dined as plainly as the establishment and the courier would let him, and having taken a short sleep by the fire for his better recovery from Mrs. Finching, he set out in a hackney cabriolet alone. The deep bell of St. Paul's was striking 9 as he passed under the shadow of Temple Bar, headless and forlorn in these degenerate days. As he approached his destination through the by-streets and waterside ways, that part of London seemed to him an uglier spot at such an hour than he had ever supposed it to be. Many long years had passed since he had seen it. He had never known much of it, and it wore a mysterious and dismal aspect in his eyes. So powerfully was his imagination impressed by it, that when his driver stopped, after having asked the way more than once, and said to the best of his belief this was the gateway they wanted, Mr. Dorrit stood, hesitating, with the coach door in his hand, half afraid of the dark look of the place. Truly, it looked as gloomy that night as even it had ever looked. 2 of the handbills were posted on the entrance wall, one on either side, and as the lamp flickered in the night air, shadows passed over them, not unlike the shadows of fingers following the lines. A watch was evidently kept upon the place. As Mr. Dorrit paused, a man passed from over the way, and another man passed out from some dark corner within, and both looked at him in passing, and both remained standing about. As there was only one house in the enclosure, there was no room for uncertainty, so he went up the steps of that house and knocked. There was a dim light in 2 windows on the first floor. The door gave back a dreary, vacant sound, as though the house were empty, but it was not, for a light was visible, and a step was audible almost directly. They both came to the door, and a chain grated, and a woman with her apron thrown over her face and her head stood in the aperture. "Who is it?" said the woman. Mr. Dorrit, much amazed by this appearance, replied that he was from Italy, and that he wished to ask a question relative to the missing person whom he knew. "Aye," cried the woman, raising a cracked voice, "Jeremiah!" Upon this, a dry old man appeared, whom Mr. Dorrit thought he identified by his gaiters as the Rusty Screw. The woman was under apprehensions of the dry old man, for she whisked her apron away as he approached, and disclosed a pale, affrighted face. "Open the door, you fool," said the old man, "and let the gentleman in." Mr. Dorrit, not without a glance over his shoulder towards his driver and the cabriolet, walked into the dim hall. "Now, sir," said Mr. Flintwinch, "you can ask anything here you think proper. There are no secrets here, sir." Before a reply could be made, a strong, stern voice, though a woman's, called from above. "Who is it?" "Who is it?" returned Jeremiah. "More inquiries. A gentleman from Italy." "Bring him up here." Mr. Flintwinch muttered, as if he deemed that unnecessary, but turning to Mr. Dorrit said, "Mrs. Clennam, she will do as she likes. I'll show you the way." He then preceded Mr. Dorrit up the blackened staircase. That gentleman, not unnaturally looking behind him on the road, saw the woman following, with her apron thrown over her head again in her former ghastly manner. Mrs. Clennam had her books open on her little table. "Oh," said she abruptly, as she eyed her visitor with a steady look. "You are from Italy, sir, are you?" "Well," Mr. Dorrit was at a loss for any more distinct rejoinder at the moment than, "Ah, well. Where is this missing man? Have you come to give us information where he is? I hope you have." "So far from it, I have come to seek information." "Unfortunately for us, there is none to be got here. Flintwinch, show the gentleman the handbill. Give him several to take away. Hold the light for him to read it." Mr. Flintwinch did as he was directed, and Mr. Dorrit read it through as if he had not previously seen it, glad enough of the opportunity of collecting his presence of mind, which the air of the house and of the people in it had a little disturbed. While his eyes were on the paper, he felt the eyes of Mr. Flintwinch and of Mrs. Clennam were on him. He found, when he looked up, that this sensation was not a fanciful one. "Now, you know as much," said Mrs. Clennam, "as we know, sir. Is Mr. Blondois a friend of yours?" "No, an acquaintance," answered Mr. Dorrit. "You have no commission from him, perhaps?" Certainly not." The searching look turned gradually to the floor after taking Mr. Flintwinch's face in its way. Mr. Dorrit, discomfited by finding that he was the questioned instead of the questioner, applied himself to the reversal of that unexpected order of things. "I am a gentleman of property, at present residing in Italy with my family, my servants, and my rather large establishment. Being in London for a short time on affairs connected with my estate, and hearing of this strange disappearance, I wish to make myself acquainted with the circumstances at first hand, because there is an English gentleman in Italy whom I shall no doubt see on my return, who has been in habits of close and daily intimacy with Monsieur Blondois. Mr. Henry Gowan, you may know the name?" "Never heard of it," Mrs. Clennam said, and Mr. Flintwinch echoed it. "Wishing to make the narrative coherent and consecutive to him," said Mr. Dorrit, "may I ask, say, 3 questions?" "30, if you choose." "Have you known Monsieur Blondois long?" "Not a 12-month. Mr. Flintwinch here will refer to the books and tell you when and by whom at Paris he was introduced to us. If that," Mrs. Clennam added, "should be any satisfaction to you, it is poor satisfaction to us." "Have you seen him often?" "No, twice, and once before, and—" "That once," suggested Mr. Flintwinch,